Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast, where we dive into how emerging technologies will impact the world and your bank account. I'm Trent Fowler, and my usual co-host Thomas Fry had another engagement, so it will be a solo episode from me tonight. Thomas and I are futurists, keynote speakers, and consultants with decades of experience in analyzing trends and communicating new developments to audiences across the world. Reach out to us at futuratipodcast.com/contact-futurati if you'd like to hire us for consulting, to speak at your event, or to advertise on our podcast. And I will just mention that I'm also in the market for another job. I was one of the millions of layoffs that have happened relatively recently. So if you know anybody who's looking for a skilled machine learning engineer or a consultant, or somebody who's got lots and lots of communications experience in something like copywriting, search engine optimization, or marketing, please feel free to reach out to me at futuratipodcast.com/contact-futurati. So I just wrapped an interview with Malcolm Ocean. Malcolm is pretty well known on Twitter, and I think he's best known for a software tool that he developed called Complice, which I discuss a little bit more in the introduction. Malcolm and I have sort of been in each other's orbit for a long time. Back in 2017, I wrote a book called The STEM Punk Project about a learning endeavor I'd undertaken, and I sent it to him, and he thought it was very insightful, and we kind of chatted a little bit about that, and it's come up in a couple of his Twitter threads in the years since. I followed his work with a lot of interest, and recently he took to Twitter and said that he'd finished up some traveling and was looking to be on some podcasts, and I said, well, I'm looking to book some people for Q4 when you want to do it, and we threw an interview together the very next day. He sent me over a vision document where he was talking about the possibility of humans today weaving themselves into sort of a collective intelligence, a superorganism. And this is a common trope in science fiction. It comes up in Ramez Nam's Nexus trilogy, for example. And I admit to being quite skeptical of it. I thought it was very interesting, and I thought he did a good job of explaining it. But there were a lot of technical details that I was unsure about, and so it was a very fertile place for us to begin a conversation. And it did not proceed anywhere near the lines that I thought it would. I figured we'd be talking about brain to brain interfaces or something similar to that, but it's actually mostly about communication. It's mostly about how you approach a conversation. And he had a lot of really interesting and insightful things to say about how you can surface assumptions and how people can learn to build trust together and function at a much, much higher level than most people experience or think is possible. So without any further ado, I hope you enjoy the episode with Malcolm Ocean. Tonight, we're joined by Malcolm Ocean. Malcolm is a software engineer and systems design expert who is best known for Complice, a tool which lets you dynamically track tasks and stay productive while pursuing various long-term projects. He also spends a lot of time thinking about how improving communication could allow groups of humans to accomplish far more than is currently possible. If you enjoy this interview, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Malcolm, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the problems you're working on.
Yeah, so I would say that one of the big questions that I keep orienting to in every moment, I feel like at the center of everybody's attention is like one or two questions that are just kind of really abstract. And for me, one of them is something like, how could this interface be better? And that shows up for me both when I think about design of objects or software, and as part of what motivated me to study systems design engineering and to go and build a piece of software called Complice, which helps people stay focused towards their goals. And Complice actually it has been where my income comes from for most of my adult life, which is great because I wanted to sort of have a passive income project that would let me spend time on whatever I wanted. And this is very convenient because it turns out that what I wanted to spend my time on was a problem that's kind of difficult to explain to people, which is the challenge of how to make human interfaces better. And, there are a lot of books out there on how to, how to communicate better, and they've all got useful stuff to say. But, for all of those books, have people really gotten that much better at communicating in the last, couple of decades? Of course, you can argue that certain other kinds of technological progress may also be stagnating, but that's sort of a different thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I find all that fascinating. Are you familiar with Michael Nielsen's work or Andy Matashak's work? Those guys who were thinking about cognitive mediums and
Mm-hmm.
what ways of better exploring mathematics or complex ideas in philosophy or science.
Yeah, so I've been that interests me for sure, and I'm interested in hypertext as a medium, and I've got an online like public Rome blog that has been a boost to my thinking for sure. So is Twitter for that matter, just in terms of being able to interlink thoughts and sort of think out loud. But where my focus has really been has actually been much more on the level of when people come together in dialogue in groups of two or groups of 5 or 10, and they're talking usually in person or something like that, and they're trying to understand each other. Where are things breaking down? Where are they kind of stepping on each other's toes? Where is and how does that stem not just from our habits but from our assumptions about what communication even is in the first place, and our sense of yeah, what it means to be communicating with people. And when our assumptions differ about what that is, how do we build common ground? Because it's not necessarily enough to try to find common ground. There might not be adequate common ground. You might have to
Right.
make it. And then if you're making it, where do you start from? And there's a deep puzzle there that I've been staring at for quite a number of years. I first got involved with doing some of this culture work about a decade ago, when I met someone who'd been doing it for many decades of her life, and sort of apprenticed under her for a number of years, and then underwent a kind of paradigm inversion where previously I'd sort of been orienting towards the best paradigm I had for understanding the world was this paradigm that she had around a shift from a coercive culture to a collaborative culture as being something that humanity's kind of been going through for a couple hundred years and will be for probably another couple hundred years. And I now have a paradigm that's based on that one, but it's my own paradigm, and this is a huge upgrade, because now it means when I've got a critique of my paradigm, I can sort it out myself rather than trying to be sort of, if I have some concern, taking it to someone else and saying, hey, well, what about this thing? And if they don't understand, then I'm just sort of left going, well, I don't really know how that relates. So I highly recommend to everybody, internalize your paradigms. If your best known paradigm is from your favorite author, find a thing that you don't think that author can explain, and do your best to integrate that with your understanding of that paradigm, because ultimately you are actually using your understanding of whatever paradigm you have in the first place. You can't not.
Mhm.
Even if you're letting an authority correct it for you, it's still your understanding that you're using day to day. And so you might as well own that and be like, well,
Right. Right.
I can take that authority, that authority's input as useful input. There may be something that I haven't yet understood about their paradigm or how it deals with this, aberrant case. I'm thinking sort of in terms of Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, and the thing where
Sure.
you get this, aberrant data. Like, how does the paradigm explain that? It's like, well, you
Right.
want to be
Right. Right.
doing that internally, not outsourcing that. So yeah, and so that's where I've been the last few years with this, and my sort of transformation came to be. I came to call it the non-naive trust dance, which is basically pointing at people doing a constant ebbing and flowing of their sense of uh, trusting and distrusting each other, which is what we're doing all the time. And then you can learn to do it better. And part of doing it better involves realizing that you're doing it, and realizing that it has certain principles where, like, oh, turns out trust does actually have to be built. This is sort of obvious, but in a lot of cases, we sort of just want people to, just trust us already, or to trust us because they seem to trust us yesterday, or whatever else. So yeah, so that's a bit about me and how I kind of came into this whole space and got to where I am.
Man, there's so many questions that I want to ask and follow up to that. I thought I would start by trying to concretize this idea of a human to human interface. I think that
Mm-hmm.
thinking about interfaces in terms of a computer with a GUI or what have you is relatively intuitive, but I'm not sure that the average person would think about there being interfaces between human beings. It's just an actual face. It's face to face. It's not an interface, right? We're
Right.
not it doesn't seem like it's mediated in any way. So could you give me like one or two examples of a human to human interface, and maybe we can talk about like what's wrong with that? I mean, it's gotten us through 50,000 years. Like,
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So great question. Cool to get to unpack this a little bit. I mean, first of all, let's take the easier case, which is the external aspects of a human to human interface. So right now, you and I are talking physically, because we're not talking in the usual sense of what people mean when we say physically, but we are talking through a world mediated through physics, just as we always are. And the physical world that we're talking through, the physical medium, involves a microphone, mine's right here, and a camera, mine's right here. Mm-hmm. And you've got a microphone and a camera and a screen, and we've got all these whole, internet connection between us. And that is the medium through which we're communicating. And so that is the external dimension of our human to human interface. And right now, we are taking for granted that interface is working. And this is particularly salient with video calls, because there are times when you can't take that for granted. You get on the call, you're like, "Can you hear me?" You're like, and then like they don't respond. You're like, "Okay, is it my?" You're like trying to puzzle it out, or somebody freezes for a moment, and you're like, "Did just the video freeze, or can they still hear?" Like,
right.
And so, but when it works, notice how it fades into the background. You don't have to think about it. The interface is just working, and we can focus on the conversation. And until I even called your attention to it, you may have even in some sense forgotten that we were even talking digitally, because it sort of wasn't relevant. Now, you might suddenly notice again if you go to eat a tasty snack and realize you can't offer me some, or if the communication channel breaks down. But only when it's sort of not working do we even notice that the interface is there. And so this is the external dimension of human to human interface, right? It's mediated through something like technology, or if we're in the same room, it's mediated through air, right? And our ability to see each other. And if the lights go out, well, now our interface is worse because we can't see each other as well, or whatever. Going a bit more internal, but still kind of external, we've got language. And so language is a human to human interface, right? And so is gesture. I don't want to reify the verbal aspects of language, but language is a great example, because it's very possible to just utterly be baffled by somebody who's very intelligent and who is attempting to do their best to communicate to you, and you're like, I can't turn that in any meaning. Sorry, man.
Yeah.
And so this is, an example again of communication breaking down. When language is working, or when it feels like it's working, we don't even think about the fact that we're using language. It is simply the medium, and it's simply in the background, and we're attending to the meanings that we're having. And then you get into situations where two people are theoretically speaking English, but in fact, they have a different meaning of some term like free will or consciousness or rationality or some other term like that. And they have some sort of debate over whether X is Y, when in fact these are a bunch of words, and the question of whether any particular X's are Y's depends on what you mean by the words. And if you're lucky, you notice this and you start sort of trying to taboo certain words and not use them, and try to find other ways to operationalize your debate. If the tree falls in a forest, well, who cares?
Right.
Why do they care? What is the actual implications of the question? And so on. And so language is sort of external, but it's sort of internal. It's external in the sense that you can easily observe it if as a third party, but it's internal in the sense that you can't, like, it's sort of, there's interpretation happening in people's heads. I don't know. I'm coming up with this framework right now on the fly to explain what I mean by human interface. So, and this is great. I'm loving this opportunity. And so then there's a third dimension, which is something about, like, what are our assumptions that we're bringing into the conversation? And some of these are linguistic, like the one I mentioned, like what do these various words mean? But we also have assumptions like, are we attempting to work together, or are we in some way in conflict? And I was just listening to this episode of the Lingthusiasm podcast yesterday, where Randall Monroe is asking Gretchen and Lauren. He says, "So why in legalese do I have to say things this way? It seems redundant." And the linguists point out that legalese is intentionally redundant because, unlike in most of communication where there's an assumption that we're cooperating to communicate, in legal context there's actually an assumption that you are not cooperating in any of your communication, that you are intentionally going to slip in every loophole you possibly can. And so the language is designed to prevent that. And on that meta level, it is actually cooperative. The lawyers are cooperating to prevent each other from exploiting each other by shared use of legalese. So that's one basic kind of assumption. Like, are you with me or are you against me? Is like a kind of assumption that people can have, and this is often very subtle. You on one level know that your girlfriend or your husband or whoever kind of romantic partner is with you, like, obviously, but then you have these moments when it sure feels like we're fighting. We are in a battle, right? And it's like, well, okay, what's that battle about? And the nature of those assumptions as they flow into the conversation are also part of the human to human interface. And so I'm gonna just jump a tad sideways to say that when we enter into some sort of explicit container, and that could be something like a podcast interview, it could be something like a therapy session, it could be something like a karate lesson, it could be something like doing circling together, it could be something like a taxi is driving you somewhere or whatever. There's some sense in which in these sort of explicit contexts, particularly when you get into something like a therapy session or whatever, there's agreements that are made up front. In this podcast, before we started recording, you told me, here's the plan. Does that sound good? Right? We're going to talk for this long. I'm going to ask you this question first, etc. Does that sound good? And I agreed to that. Right. Okay, so then at some point we're going to hit end on the podcast interview, the recording, and we're going to no longer be in a podcast. At which point, what agreements are we operating under? Where did those agreements come from? Do we even have any?
Well, I prefer total chaos and anarchy.
Yeah.
The interviews. I take all my clothes off and just sprint down the street. That's usually how I follow.
Are you going to turn the camera around so I can watch?
We've been debating live streaming that. We're just not sure if that's the right move for the vibe we're trying to cultivate.
Yeah. You might need like one of those second podcasts, right? Like they have two.
right. The after Futurati After Dark. Exactly. I would say that we default to just baseline social protocols, right? So if you and I get along, it's like fairly friendly. If we don't, it's maybe a little bit stiffer, but it's usually still polite. And I think that just comes from basic acculturation from the time that you're a child in the protocols of your culture.
Exactly. So you've used the key word there, which is culture. What we have when we don't have agreements is culture, as far as I can tell. We also have culture when we have agreements. You and I took a bunch of things for granted, like, for instance, that this interview would be conducted in English. And we are also taking other things for granted that are like even more bizarre, like, like you sort of named, it's like we're sort of taking for granted that we're not going to take our clothes off on this interview, probably, right? And until you try to name something bizarre, you don't even think about it, right? And so, but suppose there's something else, something more subtle. Maybe you have an assumption, for instance, that I'm not going to cry at any point in this interview, and maybe at some point in this interview I start crying. How do we navigate that? And it's not about that specific in general, but how do we navigate any situation in which one person and another person have different assumptions about what is acceptable or what is appropriate? Because part of the issue is that people are also going to have different assumptions about that. They're going to have different assumptions about how you navigate what happens when you have different assumptions. And so you get this sort of regressive, recursive problem that I sometimes point out as, okay, we've got a decision to make. Shall we take a vote? Who's in for a vote? Shall we take a vote on whether to take a vote? Okay, who's in for taking a vote on whether we take a vote? Okay, how many people do we need to have a majority vote? Is it 50%? Is it 60%? There's no answer to these. There's no right answer to any of these questions. And so to some extent, it reduces to two things, one of which is basically consensus, and the other of which is power. And so, consensus is basically like, and power has multiple forms. There's power over, and there's also exit power. Like if I don't like it, I can leave. And then consensus is sort of weird. There's also something maybe in the space of like grandfathered in assumptions or something, like the sort of, the code of law, as we were talking about law a few minutes ago, is built up over time. There's sort of, there's precedent. And so that's part of how we're, lawyers are codifying essentially culture, right? The shared set of expectations. But then sometimes culture evolves, and who gets to decide when culture evolves? And who gets to decide when culture evolves? And it all goes back to something. But ultimately we're all here participating in that process. And, we all have opinions, whether it's the culture of our country or the culture of our, group house or our company. We have opinions about whether that culture is working for us or not.
So you've thrown a lot at me. It's, when two entities are trying to communicate, you are embedded in what appear to me to be these concentric circles. You've got the broader default culture. Well, I say beyond that, we recognize each other as human beings. I wouldn't try to communicate with you the way I would with a tiger or whatever else.
Right. Yeah. So even if you can tell I'm from a totally foreign culture, you're still going to be modeling me as human. And that's part of the assumption that you're making. And you're assuming I'm doing the same to you.
Exactly.
Yeah, great point.
Someday that might involve robots, but as of today, it's pretty much just other human beings. You assume they're sentient and can handle complex communication. Then you've got the actual culture. Do we share any of that in common? You've got these progressively smaller subsets,
like microcultures and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And then finally, it's mediated, I would assume, by language, which is just this basic tool we use to package concepts and compress them into air and send them across nervous systems. That sounds a lot to me like, some anthropology and some modern rationality and a few other things. What is, I guess, first of all, like what's your problem with that? It seems like it's gotten us, to the moon. It's gotten us to vaccines. Like that's done pretty well. What are the issues that you see with this process? Where's it breaking down?
Well, so I mean, you just named two great examples, actually. Have we gotten to the moon? Are vaccines progress? I mean, you and I probably agree on both of those questions, but these are things that people have brought into question in the world. And how does dialogue work is sort of my core question. When people are coming from different assumptions, the attempts to bridge these gaps, and these are two very hot topics, and these are not where I would start. But I think a better example of somewhere to start would be something like, and I actually just put up a video on this earlier today, there's different kinds of cultural norms around how talking works. Not the language, but the question of who talks when and how much. And I grew up in a context here in Nova Scotia in Canada that's very high involvement culture, which means that people are doing lots of oh yeah, totally, and chiming in and finishing each other's sentences. And if you want to talk, you basically just have to butt in and keep talking until the other person shuts up. That's how conversation works here. This is also common among Jewish cultures. This is common in Australia and various other places in the world. And to greater and lesser degrees in different regions. This is in stark contrast to what are called high considerateness conversation styles. So high involvement and high considerateness. High considerateness conversational styles involve a lot of, anyway, so here's what I did this weekend. What did you do this weekend? And you're like handing the mic over to the other person. Now, these are not the only two approaches. You can also have approaches that involve saying things and just leaving spacious pauses. And maybe you end up saying an additional thing before the other person talks, or maybe you don't, and various things. Anyway, I talked about that on a video today. But the important thing that I want to highlight here is that if two people come into conversation together and one of them has high involvement conversation style and the other has high considerateness, they are both going to think that the other is rude. And it's very obvious how the high considerateness person is going to think that the high involvement person is rude, because they are going to talk nonstop and interrupt the other person. This is like very obviously rude. It's sort of very obvious to see as rude because it's very active. You know, it's like, oh, the person never shut up, and they were constantly cutting in. But from the high involvement perspective, the high considerateness is also kind of rude. It's like, don't you care about what we're talking about? You're never chiming in. You're not paying enough attention to be trying to finish my sentences. Like, not that they would ever quite say that. It was just sort of, I guess he was bored. No. I don't know. Like,
it would feel weird. It would feel weird.
Yeah, something feels off, right? Maybe chilly. More off than sort of rude in that. Yeah, more chilly. Yeah, and so things can break down when the people in those situations sort of treat the other person as actually attempting to undermine the very integrity of even being able to have a conversation in the first place. It's like, that's how you can end up perceiving the other person. And if you perceive them like that, it's going to be very hard to open up any sort of dialogue. But if you can instead imagine, okay, well, they're trying to have some sort of conversation. I don't know if I want to have that conversation. Maybe they are in fact a narcissist who actually just is literally completely uninterested in ever hearing anyone else talk. Okay. I mean, that could be true. So, you can't discount possibilities like that. There are times when the kind of conversation somebody else wants to have with you does not have any of your interest in mind at all.
Right.
Or, they're a salesperson or something who's just trying to sell you some used whatever that you don't care about. So, yeah. So I guess, yeah, pointing at the puzzle, it's like, people sometimes feel unsafe if other people don't follow certain norms, and the other people are like, wait a minute, I didn't agree to follow that norm in the first place. And go ahead.
Let me butt in there. So far it sounds like you're most interested in surfacing assumptions. So I think part of the problem is you come into a conversation with a given set of protocols that you're used to. The other person may not have the same protocols, or you may be arguing over a word like free will or consciousness where you don't agree on the definition. I think so far the problems you've described could fairly well be solved by just either having other protocols about making protocols explicit, or people who are better able to break their concepts down, who have a more explicit epistemology by which they arrive at concepts and by which they can explain what they mean. Because a good philosopher ought to, and it doesn't have to be like a philosophically minded person or just a careful thinker, ought to be able to say, like, when I use this term, what I mean is the following things. There ought to be something they could point to in reality.
Totally, yeah. And I don't think I've got anything particularly novel to say about semantic confusions, to be clear. I just was using them as another example. Let's see if I can go a little deeper.
Always love to go deeper.
Yeah. So suppose that two people are having a disagreement over whose fault something is. They may have various various differences in view, various different opinions, they may even have different pieces of information, right? One person saw this happen, the other person saw that happen, one person knows this about this person, the other knows that about this person. They've got different, different pieces that they're bringing to that conversation. But there's an even, there's a deeper thing though that is not in question in this, who's at fault conversation, which is the idea that there's somebody at fault in the first place. And that is a very deep cultural assumption that has permeated most of human cultures over at least, most of history. The question of whether indigenous cultures or, prehistoric cultures in any place used notions of blame is less clear. Some signs point to no, but depends on what you mean by blame, and that's not really what I'm interested in. But what I am interested in, though, is that it does seem that you get a whole different type of conversation possible in certain situations when both people can trust that the conversation is oriented towards something other than fault finding and blame finding. And it turns out that unlike semantic confusions, which are relatively straightforward to resolve if people have enough patience and enough willingness to slow down, first of all, a lot of people don't even theoretically agree with me. They're like, no, actually figuring out whose fault things this is a very important thing that we should do a lot of the time. And even among people who do theoretically agree with me, such as myself, we still sometimes find it difficult to, in fact, orient truly to a conversation like that, because the fear of the blame arrow getting swung around and pointed at us is very deep and very unconscious and automatic. So there's a kind of an automatic response that's like, oh, if I hear what you're saying as potentially blamey or judgmental, I need to immediately jump in and defend myself. Otherwise, I might something's not going to be okay. And we could try to trace back exactly why this is. And I've recently, in the last 3 years or so, updated towards okay, there's a lot of need for therapeutic processes as part of this, deep emotional learning and releasing of those fears, and really honoring them, really honoring that they represent something real, even if we don't know what that is.
Hello, this is Trent Fowler, co-host of the Futurati podcast. One of the most common pieces of marketing advice I've come across is to know your audience and give them what they want. One difficulty in podcasting is that it's actually pretty hard to do this. None of the major platforms give us any way to reach out to you, our listeners, to find out what you enjoy about the Futurati podcast and what you'd like to see done differently. So we've decided to record this commercial and ask you directly to reach out to us. Head over to futuratipodcast.com, go to the contact page, and drop us a line. Tell us about your favorite and least favorite episodes, what you'd like to see us cover in the future, and anything else you want us to know. We produce this show for you, and we want your advice so we can make it even better. Thank you.
That strikes me as maybe not purely epistemological. I mean, there's a lot of psychology there too, and like psychoepistemology, where the two bridge. For example, a person can just be automatically defensive because they were attacked a lot as a child, so they just sort of go on the attack when they feel that. But I think taking a step further back, it seems like in a professional setting, for example, or even a relationship, a lot of that would stem from a lack of clear communication at prior points, where it's like, this is the thing you're responsible for, and if this doesn't get done, then it's your fault. Like, I feel like this is an ideal. It will not always be possible to do it this way, especially like in a startup or a chaotic environment. But by and large, I think that if you're an intelligent and responsible person, you ought to know if you're at fault, if the processes were defined relatively clearly. It's like, this is the thing you were supposed to do. Was it done or not? Like, where there's sensible extenuating circumstances, because you got shot. I guess there's nothing you could do about it. But like, you ought to be able to walk into that meeting being relatively sure of what you were at fault for, or what you were not at fault for, if the communication was handled appropriately earlier and responsibilities were clearly delineated. So it seems like that's also a matter of just getting clearer at the semantic layer of these interactions, right?
Well, I that's not how I see it. I think a substantial chunk of it can be solved in that way.
What's left?
And that's worth doing. Well, so I mean, the part of what I highlighted earlier was not the question of whether in this instance anyone was at fault, or whether we sort of, like, I'm not saying people aren't at fault because things weren't defined clearly enough in order to sort of carve out whose responsibilities are whose. I'm pointing at something like the entire, so like I sometimes like to point out that blame is a type of explanation, which is different from anger, which is an emotion, which you might feel while blaming somebody, or shame, which is an emotion you might feel while being blamed or blaming yourself or whatever. But blame is a type of explanation. And from some substantial investigation I've done into this, although unfortunately we'll see how good of a conveying I can do of this explanation, but from staring at this question on some pretty deep levels, I've come to have the sense that blame as a type of explanation is confused in the same sort of way that geocentrism is confused. Like, the sun does not go around the earth goes around the sun in some sense. Now, does that mean that the sun doesn't rise and set? I mean, no, it does. I mean, visually, in terms of what we mean when we say that, those events still occur. I'm not denying those. Likewise, does that mean that there isn't some sort of tempting truth to what blame is saying, and some approximationness of it that's roughly, kind of points at something? If certainly if to go back to the earlier thing, if our internet broke down, we could say, is it on my end or is it on yours? We might have trouble asking that question because of the internet breakdown, but we could say, oh, sorry, my bad, my dog is downloading cat videos again, and using up all the bandwidth,
Right.
and I'll go get him to stop, right? So sort of, I've got the leverage point to solve this problem is a different question than whose fault is it, or something I did caused this problem is slightly different than whose fault is it, because causality is many faceted and multi-layered. And in general, when you're dealing with things that sort of aren't professional but are more like, well, and even professional things are difficult. If you actually do cause an appropriate post-mortem of some disaster, you'll usually find that 5 or 10 people could have prevented it, and now some of them it's more obvious, but that many people had some sort of role in whatever disaster occurred. And there's no, you can't divide up fault. Okay, it's 20% this person's fault, 40% this person's fault. That represents a confused understanding of causality.
So is your claim
a lot of this comes out of systems thinking literature?
So the concept of blame in your framework, it points at something real, but are you making an epistemological claim that it's almost never possible to really drill down enough or pinpoint the causality enough to place that at someone's feet?
It's
like, what about a really obvious example? Like, what if I just go in and I delete all the tables in the SQL database, like just because I'm a dick, right? Like, so that's my fault, right? But from there, it just becomes more confused and it winds up being really hard to say for certain.
Yeah, but we could still say, who gave you the permission to do that? And like, who sort of falsely trusted you that let you do that, or who pissed you off the day before? Like, why in fact did that happen? And given that it isn't happening, this is a hypothetical, right? Like, it's not happening because there was adequate trust in the whatever. You're probably not referring to any SQL databases in particular, right? This is a hypothetical company we work at or something, but
yeah. So I think I would disagree with that. I take your point, right? But I think there's a limit to the reasonableness of the precautions that you can take. At a certain point, I just, like, the person who gave me permissions had no reason to think that I was like a destructive sociopath. If I've been giving off signs for a year, then maybe somebody should have noticed. And you say, look, it was pretty clear that there was a train wreck coming towards us and nobody did anything to stop it. You can find examples like that.
So
are you enjoying this episode of the Futurati podcast? If so, please like it, give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. By far, the best way to help us grow is to spread the word on social media, which will expose our content to more people and help us continue to bring you interviews with world-leading experts in AI, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and so much more. Thank you in advance.
Like, I wouldn't say the person who gave me database permissions bears any fault for that at all. If they had no reason to think that I was dangerous, if it was all standard stuff, if up till yesterday I'd been a perfectly sane and good employee, it doesn't seem like they deserve even 1% of the blame for that. I think it's my fault, clearly and unambiguously.
Right.
And as for the person who pissed me off, it's like, are you sure? So maybe they were way too aggressive, but even there, it's
we're now in an instantiation of the kind of thing that we're talking about here, where we have slightly different frames.
We get fucking meta, man. We get fucking meta around here.
So, you're saying, well, I wouldn't give them even 1% of the blame, and the part of the thing I'm trying to say is there is no blame. It does not exist. Now, that's a separate question from should you be fired. And probably you should be fired. Maybe. I don't know.
Why?
I don't know enough about the situation. Well, to stop you from doing it again.
So what would you what would you say if a person what's the word you would use for that? I am clearly and unambiguously responsible for this bad thing. If it's not blame, what do you call that state of affairs where I'm called into the council of elders and shamed and sent packing? What does that look like? This is a really interesting company that we're sketching. It's got elders and SQL databases.
Yeah. Oh, hang on. I got my camera following me, which is going to be a little bit.
No, it's been doing that for a while, actually.
Oh, it's sort of unnecessary, I think. There we go. So what I would say is, I would say so, I spoke earlier to sort of, when communication breaks down, sort of what does it end up resting on, and coming to places of things like consensus and things like power, and the situation where somebody, so I would call that a betrayal. And it's a betrayal in the sense that you in this situation, the jerk you who deleted the databases, used power to do something that was power that you only had because people trusted you not to do that something.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some amount of reasonableness kind of going on in the background of this. Yep. They didn't specify in advance, don't delete this SQL database, right. Don't delete that SQL database, don't poison the dog, don't, like, it didn't like lay out all the things you have to not, don't poison the dog with cyanide, don't poison the dog with strychnine. Mm-hmm. Right. They're not laying these all out in advance, but, if you offer to your friend, hey, can you, feed my cat while I'm on vacation? And the friend, steals your jewelry while, coming into the house to feed your cat. Right. There's a background sense of, look, I wouldn't have let you into my house if I'd known you were gonna steal the jewelry. And likewise with the database. So that's what I call betrayal. There's been some kind of trust extended that has then been sort of turned out to be faulty, basically, mm-hmm. Right?
Really founded.
Yeah. But also, like, the sort of the person doing the betraying sort of could have known. Now, I don't know whether to use the word betrayal to refer to situations where the person doing the betraying sort of couldn't have known, or where it was an accident. It starts to get a little fuzzier there, right? Like, suppose that I go to someone's house and they say, make yourself at home, and I have a drink from the fridge, and they were like, I actually didn't mean that when I said make yourself at home. Or I mean, you can, and some people are like, what do you mean? Surely make yourself at home means that. Well, I can just go further. Suppose you say make yourself at home, and I say, yeah, I don't really like the curtains, I'm going to replace them, right? Like, how home do you want me to make myself, right? There's some implicit assumption being made there. And, and mostly we get it right, and then we get it wrong, and someone apologizes, and it's sort of fine. Although the nature of apologies is actually itself very closely connected with this whole blame thing. Right. Because aside from situations that are straight up antagonistic, like if you were, a person who got yourself hired by that company for the purpose of screwing them over or something, right? Like, mm-hmm. But like, leaving aside situations that are sort of extremely in that direction, if you've got a situation where you go over to your friend's house, they say, make yourself at home, you take a shower, I don't know, and they're like, what? I didn't say you could take a shower. And you're like, you said make myself at home, and I wanted to shower, and that was what I needed to feel comfortable, so I took a shower. So in that situation, the person who has sort of, wronged the other person in some sense, what I would say is they haven't done anything wrong in terms of how they were understanding the situation, but they have created some wrong for the other person. And this is sort of a intersubjective morality type of perspective, but it's not arbitrary. Like, the wrong really didn't exist for the wronger, and the wrong really did exist for the wrongee. Like, it's not arbitrary. And so the question of was the person at fault, it's like, well, you have to invoke a whole frame in order to say that. And in general, people don't act wrongly from their own perspective. And so the act of attempting to blame someone is negating the very perspective that caused them to do what they did, usually. If not, in some sense, always, in a sort of almost tautological sense.
Yeah, I have some follow-ups to that. I think that comes down to like it's more epistemology and like the objectivity of frames, but I don't want to spend the entire conversation on that. I want to hear a little bit about your 100x vision, and like if we could tie it together so it's not such like an abrupt shift. Like how do you see updated human to human interfaces contributing to collective intelligence? Because it seems like that's really more the thing you're after, right? Like in your vision
Absolutely.
statement, it's like these cells of humans, 8 to 10 people who are working together, and they've resolved all these
Yep.
problems, and they're contributing in a way that's sort of more than what any team does today.
Yeah.
So it's a future show. So where do you see it going? How do you want to fix this to arrive at these systems?
Great. So I think I can tie it pretty tightly. So you know how I pointed at how we have been talking while not questioning whether the internet's working, and that's been nice. And you can imagine how awful it would be if every 30 seconds we were wondering how the internet's working. Like we'd barely be able to have a conversation, right?
Right.
And that happens sometimes, and usually you just give up. You're like, look, let's talk another time when the whatever is better. So the case that I'm making basically is that most human conversations have a substantial amount of assumptional baggage that is as if the internet is very patchy.
Yeah. Okay.
And that it's possible to untangle those and get to a place where a lot of things can fade into the background that in an ordinary conversation, the kind that we're experiencing now, the kind that we are experiencing usually in our lives, I lost track of the start of my sentence. We can get those out of the way such that it produces a shift in clarity and effective communicational bandwidth that is comparable to when the internet suddenly starts working. You switch off your terrible Wi-Fi onto tethering, and you're like, oh, now we can talk, and it like fades into the background. So it's like, basically my claim is that the level of relief where we're like, oh, now we can talk when the internet starts working, there is a level beyond that I have experienced with people numerous times, that I think various people may have experienced little glimpses of at times when you get really into flow with a team on something and everything's just going and somebody messes up, but you're like, hey dude, you messed up, and like, oh yeah, totally, let me fix that, and shoop, 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 and it's all flowing, and people aren't, doing the defensive thing that gets in the way of that. And because again, it's not about, there's not, responsibility for things, and it's not about like not being able to point that out or not being able to give feedback or anything like that. In fact, feedback flows way more smoothly and directly when you get all this stuff out of the way. And when you do that, there's this experience of like, wow, it's like I'm part of a group mind here, not in like a hive mind sense of us all being, the Borg or whatever, undifferentiated. We're actually even more differentiated than usual, and we're able to contribute our perspectives and have those perspectives consistently be received and heard, and not find ourselves being like, or when we are like, we're like, oh, interesting, how do we work with that? And so there's a kind of recursive capability to see where things are breaking down and orient to the breakdown together, rather than the breakdown producing a meta breakdown and a meta breakdown, and a kind of, well, now we're just at an impasse and Thanksgiving is real awkward.
Yeah, a clusterfuck cascade. So like, tell me what that looks like. I don't want to take too much of your time. So like what are one or two improvements to human interfaces that might lead to this sort of thing?
Great. So one really simple one, not necessarily easy to do, but simple in some sense, is if you are in a conversation and somebody is saying something and you're like, you seem to think this, which is obviously false. Like, you seem to think I'm the sort of person who would do that, and I would never do that. How could you possibly think I'm the sort of person? What kind of asshole do you have to be to think that I'm the kind of person who would do that? You're having some sort of like, somebody's projecting on you or something, and you're like, that projection is such a non-fit for me that I'm offended that you'd even think that about me. Okay, well, first of all, take a moment and acknowledge that sucks, that you don't like being perceived in that way, and just really like, yeah, I do not like being perceived in this way. And then, having done that, gently point out to the person that that's not true. And it's really important that you do the grounding first. But the key is, and the way I usually operationalize this is, if it feels like something should go without saying, and yet somebody is demanding that you say it, just say it. Just say the obvious thing, the thing that feels so obviously true. I have a video on this. I don't want to go too much more into it, but I can send you the video and we can link it in the whatever. Second thing is, in general, if two people, so one really common assumption that people have, some people even codify it into the law of the excluded middle, which is true when it comes to the logical domains in which it's defined, and false nearly everywhere else. Some people make the assumption that if I think one thing and you think, if I think A, whatever A is, and you think not A, that one of us at least is wrong. Maybe we're both wrong. And it turns out that that isn't actually the case. And one reason for this is the semantic disagreements that I pointed out earlier. You know, we literally mean a different thing by the word that we're using. You know, is it raining right now? Yeah, it's raining. See, look, there's 2 drops that came down. Is it raining right now? No, it's not raining. If it were raining, I'd want a jacket out to go for a walk, and I don't want a jacket out to go for a walk. Therefore, it's not raining, right? Like, these are just different meanings of raining. But sometimes it's much more subtle stuff that goes all the way back to childhood assumptions about whatever, you know, there's some difference in the world that you're seeing that is, you know, some different experiences have caused you to make different generalizations, and the generalizations contradict. But you've been living in the same world the whole time. And so what you actually know about the world does not contradict. Your actual knowing, which is deeper than the verbal generalization you've made over top. It's deeper than the emotional generalization you've made over top, like dogs are scary, right? And by even just taking as a sort of assumption that what everybody knows is in some sense true, they just might be knowing it messily. You come to a different place where every time you're in conversation, you're now seeing, okay, you know, like earlier when you were saying, oh, but this thing about blame, it's like, it would be easy for me to either doubt myself, like doubt my own sense of like, oh, is it possible to have an entirely blame-free conversation? Maybe it's not. And sometimes that doubt is useful, but often it sort of is just more neurotic. Or it would be possible for me to be like, you just don't get it. It's like, well, no, it's not you just don't get it. You are getting something else, and you're asking me to help you get your something and my something at the same time. And you're asking me to also get your something and my something at the same time. And so by having that as a basic assumption, rather than the law of the excluded middle, either A or B is true, but not both, or either A or not A is true, but not both. By having that assumption into your conversations, you're much more likely to have those experiences of, oh, I'm now seeing something deeper than I was seeing before, because I'm seeing what you're seeing and I'm seeing what I'm seeing, and the two of those come together, and now we're seeing something deeper together.
It's very Hegelian. It's very Hegelian.
Yeah, very Hegelian.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. It's a shame because this is stuff I've actually been thinking about a lot recently too.
I'm game to talk for another 5, 10, 15 minutes. I don't know if you have a max length for your podcasts themselves, but I don't have to go.
I don't know if you want to continue down this road, that sounds
Let's do it.
Yeah. So how about this? In the last couple of minutes, do you have ideas for any tools that might aid this? Because one thing that I've been very interested in over the years is argument mapping software or dialogue scaffolding that allows you to do some of these things that surface assumptions and sort of guides you down ways. Like, do you find anything in that domain that's compelling to you, or do you really think it just comes down to people doing a better job of handling their concepts? Because it seems to be like a lot of what you're saying comes down to that. It's how do you
I do think a tremendous amount of it happens way before any representational stuff that's out in the external world. I do think that those could help as scaffolds. You know, let me just briefly imagine, like, let's say this conversation, for instance, like what would I have wanted to like better navigate our question around blame? Um, I mean, it's not really stuff that doesn't in some ways exist already. Like what I would say is like once you've got like when you have better assumptions, like the kind, you know, the kind of stuff that I'm pointing at, um, you can use very simple tools like a pen and a piece of paper or a whiteboard to like draw something on, or you know, a bulleted list for listing out here are some things that we seem to disagree on, right? Like, you know, and then you can sort of explore, well, what do each of us mean by that, and kind of unpack it. You know, you can use very simple tools quite effectively. Like, I don't think there's sort of obviously missing hardware for that. Oh, one thing I will say though is that just in general, like a tool that already exists is the use of recorded conversations as a way when people are trying to learn this. In some of the cultures that I've been in, where we've been trying to prototype this, you know, collaborative superorganism that I talk about in the 100x vision, we've done a lot of recording our conversations, and that's partially so that we can share them with other people who are kind of in the larger group that we're part of, to sort of help people kind of get in sync, even if they weren't part of a conversation. But also, you know, we can make transcripts and we can go and investigate. And there was one instance where, you know, I had a long conversation with one person, and then we made a transcript of that, and then we shared it with another person. And part of the long conversation was us talking about this third person and what we thought her perspective might be like. And so then she went through and highlighted with a few different colors, kind of things that she found hard to dialogue with. It wasn't things that she disagreed with. It was more like, here's a way where you phrased something where I find there's not space for my perspective in it. So I'm going to try rephrasing it, and I'm going to try to rephrase it to mean what you meant in a way that also makes space for my perspective. But also, if I rephrase it in a way that negates or omits something important of what you were trying to say, well, we can rephrase it again. And so we kind of went back and forth with this a couple times, and that was quite informative. So I think like that's one technique that, you know, people could use is you know, and that would be sort of a scaffold for perspective taking. It's like trying to rephrase what someone else said that you find objectionable to still mean what they mean and not feel objectionable to you. And there's various verbal tools for doing that, which you know, I statements are a classic example. There's many others.
Do you need a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker for an event? Thomas Fry and me, Trent Fowler, are both seasoned keynote speakers, able to converse on a wide array of topics to audiences of all sizes and skill levels. Go to the contact page at futuraudiopodcast.com to book Thomas or myself today, and let us apply our years of experience in public speaking to make your event a smashing success.
That's that's all very compelling. I had never heard of that, but it strikes me as obvious that would really help. I'm curious, as sort of a final question, if you could paint the picture for how you see this in the limit, because I can imagine that communication would get much better and people would click better. It's hard for me to imagine that you'd actually get some sort of superorganism out of it, or it would be, you know, you would just so dramatically outperform everybody else that it would catch on. So I mean, what do you see as possible under this? What kinds of projects could people take on that today really just aren't feasible?
Yeah, so I think we're already seeing this a little bit through like I am like slow bullish on crypto and Web3 stuff. Like I'm not thinking anything particularly exciting is going to happen this year for any given year, but I'm like cool stuff is on the way. And one of the things that I saw, I forget the term for this, but they called it something like super teams or something like that. And they were talking about these sort of a bunch of people with different specialties coming together and each working only a few hours a week on this particular project. But it was a project that couldn't have been carried out by one person who wouldn't have had all these specialties, and also would have been too small of a project for a full-time team to take on because everybody only needed to work a few hours a week. And it had all these sort of interesting constraints where it was like, we could only do this because this DAO that we were using enabled us to kind of come together and and sort of form this emergent team that, you know, has skin in the game, where each person's getting compensated in tokens based on their, you know, involvement or whatever. And part of what's powerful about this is that, like I was saying earlier, you know, one of the most important types of power that people have is the ability to just nope out of something. Mm-hmm. And this is very hard to do with sort of conventional jobs. You're either noping out of your whole livelihood or not. Right. And you can try to petition for like, hey, I'd kind of like things to be a little different in this and such a way, you know, could we do that? But either like you're kind of in or you're out. Like you don't have a lot of, you know, well, if things don't change, I'm going to work half time. Like you just usually don't have that as a actual move available. Right. And so we're going to see, like, you know, whether for DAOs or whether for crypto or other reasons, like this is also a cultural shift. This is not simply a, like doing this requires a cultural shift, not just the technology. Right. And you could actually do most of it without the crypto, like just, you know, if you had enough, whatever other factors. The crypto maybe enables you to do this without as much trust in the individual people or something.
Exactly. Lowers the friction cost.
Actually, here's another way I'll put it. So, you know, people talk about trustless systems, and I'm not a trustless systems guy. I'm like really high trust guy. But what I would say is that you can either be trusting the people or you can be trusting the architecture of the thing. Yeah. And so, you know, when I buy something online or whatever, I'm trusting in part a bunch of implicit architecture such that I don't get scammed. You know, I don't really trust this random site that's selling me some cool shirt. But I'm trusting that if it were scamming, there's a good chance that Google or its payments processor or something would have like gotten rid of it by now. Yeah. Right. And so there's sort of implicit trust in the kind of the system overall. And I'm also trusting myself that if I lost $30 trying to buy a cool shirt, I'd forgive myself, you know, so it wouldn't be a big deal. That's important. That's actually really important. Yeah. You can't take those kinds of risks if you're going to beat yourself up for them. So you need trust. And I think of trust as being what truth feels like in first person, is one way that I frame it. And another frame that I quite like, which is compatible with this other one, is trust is an unquestioning attitude, or I sometimes like to say an undoubting attitude. And so throughout most of this call, except when I mention it, we have been not questioning whether the internet is working. You know, every time, you know, I mention it, we briefly notice, yep, it's still working. But when I'm not mentioning it, we're not even thinking about it, right? Again, we forget about it. We just treat it as true that the internet is working. Yeah. Until some evidence pops up in our face. You know, oh, you're frozen. You know, you're cutting out. Like, but we sort of just treat it as true. And so, you can use DAOs to allow people to treat more things as true. Just let them fade into the background. Oh, of course, we're going to get paid for the work that we do in this and such a way, even though we don't have a legal contract or whatever, and we don't know who each other is. Of course, that's still going to work out. You know, and you can let that stuff fades into the background and lets the work come into the foreground. So likewise, when you have a group of people that is able to really powerfully resolve subtle disagreements in expectations or differences in values or differences in perspective of any kind, when you have a group that can rely on that capacity so well that it fades into the background, that's when you have a superorganism, because you're now just a being that is orienting to the world and you're saying, hey, do we want this? And your ability to suss out what we want is so solid that you can feel into it the same way that you can be like, do I want another slice of pizza? Nah, I think I'm full. Like you can just kind of feel into it and you kind of get an answer, and the answer sort of, you know, resolves. Now you might have an internal conflict. You can't always do that with yourself, for sure, especially when it comes to slices of pizza. But the capacity to do it with yourself is also part of this, is a necessary part of the capacity to do it with other people too. Like you need to be able to check in with your own system. And then, so then you can have a collective system that you can say, okay, do we want to do this? Yeah, we would want to do it if we were capable of this thing. Do we think we're capable of this thing? Well, I've got this capability. What do you have? And we can sort of into is like, okay, yeah, I think we can do this. It might be tough. Like, is this gonna? And then you can really ask all the questions. You can say, hey, okay, I think we can do this, but it's going to be a bit stressful in week 3. Now, Bob, you have a, like we know that you've got a whatever thing in week, coming up that you're going to be going on a vacation or paternity leave, or you've got this other project that you're doing. Is this going to be too stressful for you? And people can really ask those questions and much more directly than they can in a situation where there's like a subtle pressure to say yes anyway, right? And then you end up overextended. But whose fault was that you got overextended? Was it yours, or was it the people who pressured you into accepting an expectation that you weren't actually able to deliver on, that they probably could have known if they thought, but once the blame thing gets out of the way, you can just be collectively feeling into what do we all want, and how would that work, and how would that work really well, and is this going to be a fit, and how do we navigate if this happens here, and it all just happens at the speed of thought, and at the speed of speech, and the speed of sense making of the situation. So that's my attempt to kind of paint that image.
Yeah,
I think it's the best I've ever done it. So
okay, well, good. So that makes a lot more sense. The blame thing. I think I see the class of phenomena that you're pointing at. I have to think a little bit more carefully about how that would affect my own conceptions of it. But I see the thing that you're thinking about.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I really appreciate you sketching all of this for me, and hopefully we can talk more about it again in the future.
Yeah, totally. For anyone who wants to, could be you or could be people listening, if you want to dive more into like, what does it mean to say there is no blame? There's a bunch of systems thinking books that are great for this. If you want a more organizational oriented book, I'd recommend The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. The fifth discipline being systems thinking. If you want a more Buddhist book, I'd recommend Mutual Causality in Buddhism and General Systems Theory by Joanna Macy, although that may be out of print now. But I think there's a digital version available. And then just great general purpose systems thinking book would be Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows, but it doesn't really go into the stuff on blame, whereas the first two that I mentioned are quite powerful for that.
Fascinating. Okay. Well, there you have it, guys. Check all those books out. And where can they go to find out more about you?
So you can check out my Twitter, which is Malcolm_Ocean. Note that Malcolm has a silent L in it, like Lincoln, or like the word calm. Calm is arguably less silent. But anyway, MALCOLM_Ocean is my Twitter handle, and malcolmocean.com is my blog, which has writing on a lot of these topics. And I assume there will be somewhere with show note type links, and there'll be a link to the 100x vision that we've been sort of gesturing at a little bit, and I can send you links to some of the videos that I mentioned as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. It was great getting this chance to go over all this with you. I really, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, this has been awesome. Thanks for drawing it out of me. It's like these conversations pull out the expressions. So I love that.
Absolutely.